Good evening. My name is Matthew Ogden. I'm an editor with LaRouchePack.com. Tonight is November 30th, 2012, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to our weekly Friday live internet broadcast. We're coming off of a very intense week of intervention into the United States Congress with a successful intervention from LaRouche Pack into Washington, D.C., shaping the discussions that are happening inside the halls of government. And several delegations coming in from up and down the East Coast, including constituency meetings that were set up by activists, many of you who are viewing this webcast tonight. We intend to continue this activity into the coming weeks and intensify it, especially around a publication of a document by Michael Kirsch, an associate of ours, who I had the pleasure of reading a pre-release copy, exposing the treason of Andrew Jackson. This is a document which will be published over the course of this weekend, and I know that Mr. LaRouche has put a premium on the subject matter that's addressed in this document. And I know this is something that we will be discussing over the course of the proceedings tonight. So we will be proceeding according to the same schedule, the same format that we have previously, with an opening statement by Mr. LaRouche followed by discussion. So without further ado, I give you Mr. LaRouche.
You're in a situation which is comparable to an explosion in history. This often happens and people fail to realize it. For example, you take all the energy flux density standards which we know of, which mankind has gone through. Mankind started, with, at least defined as mankind, by one thing, by fire. Mankind is the only living creature which lives on basis of progress through fire. Now, fire takes a number of levels of concentration. We have ordinary wood-burning fire, and a wood-burning fire is the kind of thing you would expect a caveman or something, but a human being, leaving behind, where he dies or something, his bones and some things he ate and evidence of that and this and that. But you know that he used fire, and mankind uses fire. And just as living processes generally evolve from lower states of concentration of energy flux density to higher ones, so mankind, which is the only creature which has a voluntary ability to shape history. All other animals, for example, function in a different way. They function by, it happens to them. It falls upon them. But mankind changes by voluntary actions to change man's character. And these changes always correlate with an increase in energy flux density. We've gone through all the things you burn. We're now past that. We're now to something, a new kind of burning. Uranium, that's very primitive stuff. That's almost Stone Age these days. Then you get into thermonuclear fusion and antimatter reaction, which is where we're in the process of transition to that, and we will soon be at matter-antimatter reaction if mankind continues to exist in this universe. All right. So what you have now, you have a typical situation of mankind, of the way the universe functions and so forth. You think things are getting quiet. Then you think things are becoming ominously quiet. And then you're ready for the explosion. And that's the situation we're in now. The Obama administration and what it represents, and the British Empire and what it represents, cannot continue in its present course. An explosion point is about to be reached. It could be thermonuclear war. All the means for thermonuclear war exist. The United States has a leading quotient of the capability of thermonuclear war. Britain has lost much of that. France has lost much of its nuclear capability and so forth. But things are building up to a breaking point at which Compression leads to explosion. So therefore, any assumption that something is fixed, that something is settled, like the idiots who thought that the election is over. The election is not over. The process of the explosion has yet to come. And that's where people make fools of themselves, assuming that something is settled, when what is settled is the inevitability of an explosion in things. Now, we have to be of any use to mankind. We, me, others, have to see what it is that we can do to change this. Now, in point of fact, people talk about votes, and they tend to think that the number of votes or the similar kind of massive collection of some sort builds up to your strength, where you become stronger, more capable. But in the history of pyrotechnics, increase in intensity, increase in change of state means explosions, and very deadly ones. And that's where we are now. We have three levels to be concerned with, the alternatives, and those that we'll get into some today. But the question is, the main question is the organization of the nation-state system, and the fact that the Queen of England, who is actually the head of an empire, anyone who understands the history of empires, the history of mankind, knows that the British Empire is an empire. And it is not the English people. It's an institution just like the Roman Empire or the empires before then or afterwards, which have exploded themselves and taken a new form. Sometimes another empire has come to replace the old one. And there are changes in the empires as they go through these transitions. But that's where we are. We're at the point of a potential explosion. Now, and we're also in a situation where, as I just said, the nature of history is determined by the way in which mankind as a species is able to willfully progress from a lower state to a higher state. And right now what we have is we have a nation which is getting more and more explosive, but it's not going anywhere. For example, let's take the Queen of England. You take her, right? The Queen of England is an empress. She represents, for example, all of Africa, a subject which may come up today in discussion. All of Africa. Susan Rice is well known. Here she is in contention now. She's well known from back in the 20 years or so ago. She's known as a mass murderer in Africa. Now she married a husband, different husband later on in life, but she still has this propensity. She, in Kenya and other areas, she was an apostle of mass murder. That's what she remains to be. Another case, Africa, all of Africa is now threatened with genocide, ready to break out. The Middle East is ready to break out. Europe is ready to break into a general breakdown crisis of a hyperinflation. These things are now inevitable. And in the course of history, it is not the mass of people who actually make the decisions which are the necessary decisions to get man out of a mess into which mankind has wandered again. And the problem is, therefore, that those of us who understand what leadership is, what creative leadership is, and real leadership is that which leads to a higher state of existence of mankind in the human equation. Other kinds of leadership, mass leadership, where the masses lead, stupidity reigns and disaster is consequent. So you're now in a period where those of us who can bring together to create leadership from an intelligentsia inside, from all walks of life, but inside society. We're headed for an explosion in the Middle East, explosion throughout Africa, explosion elsewhere, and readiness for thermonuclear war. That's where we are. And only those of us who can understand this are capable of making a useful contribution to mankind's effort to escape from this problem. And that's the matter we have to deal with tonight. We're on the edge of a disaster. There's reactions from some people, a very limited number of people, and that's good, because only from a very limited number of people do the eyes ever come, the wisdom ever come, which will lead to a solution in a situation like this. The masses will panic, not because they're bad people, but just because they're masses who don't have any understanding of how society works. And when things don't work the way they know how they should work, and from their standpoint, they panic because they don't have any other answers. They have answers that no longer work and lead to simple desperation and to mass destruction. So therefore, what we're doing tonight and so forth, as before and again, is coming to a point, an explosion point, at which, at some near point, either we change the system or it blows. And it's ready to blow over this week, over this year end, sometime over this year end. Unless a change occurs, an intervention which is an unexpected, an unusual, an atypical reaction from a small group of leaders in society who are able to assemble themselves to lead society into a vision of what is a true solution, as we saw the case of Franklin Roosevelt's leadership as he came into office back in the 1930s. It was his leadership and a very small number of people around him who actually saved the United States from hell in the 1930s. It was his preparation and the people around him who led to that solution. And when he died, and he was replaced by an evil jerk called Truman, then we slid back again, back into the old evil ways. We had a great president, Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. He was inspired by Mrs. Roosevelt. He was inspired by others. They led a great change from the 1930s rather, and so forth, problem. We went into a period of progress. The space program was a product of this development. That development in particular, it's already in process, but he seized upon it. Other things that he seized upon, Kennedy. And then he was killed. And everything moved from that point on in an opposite direction. Yes, we had presidents who tried to do something. We had in the 1930s, you had a funny president who did try to do something, and he meant it. The STI was my baby. And he became a part of it. He adopted it. And it made it happen. It was also made to happen by people in Germany, leaders from the old school, leaders in the Gaullist in France, people like that. There was a movement of leadership even then, but then it was over. And now we've been going ever since. We were already going downhill from the time that Kennedy was killed. The United States has always gone down, really, in net effect, ever since Kennedy and his brother Robert were killed. That's the fact. And in the years that followed, in the decades that have followed, down, down, down. The standard of living of our people is down, down, down. The expectation of life is down, down, down. Everything is down, down, down. And you're now headed toward an explosion point, unless we can change it. And that's what we have to do.
Thank you very much. You're watching a live webcast with Mr. LaRouche. Now, we have several topics that we wish to take up during the discussion period here. What I'd like to begin with is what we mentioned in the beginning, a new document which is in pre-publication form from Michael Kirsch. And I'd like to ask Leandra Bernstein to come to the podium to address some of the content of this.
Thank you. Now, this question does concern the release of this paper that Michael Kirsch wrote, titled "The End of the American Credit System," also How the Nation Was Lost. And as our viewers probably know, Michael Kirsch is the principal author of the NWAPA 21 plan, the report that's available on this website. But in this report, I think the significance of it is its pedagogical usefulness. In looking at the administration of Andrew Jackson himself being the chosen tool of his controllers, among which, for example, Aaron Burr was a notorious traitor and asset in direct communication with the British Crown, an asset of Great Britain. And I'll just say, I mean, what is covered in this paper is really how the nation was lost at that period in history, from the loss of the presidential election by John Quincy Adams to Andrew Jackson in 1828 up until the Civil War, with effects that continue on today. For example, the failure to have a majority in Congress to override President Jackson's veto of the rechartering of the Second National Bank has created a situation in this country where still to this day, despite advances under various different presidencies, we have never returned to that system that served us so well from the presidency of George Washington up until John Quincy Adams, of a national banking system. And I'd like to, without saying too much, because I'd hate to give away the ending, but the paper will be published on the website soon, and there's very little I can say that I haven't already said. So the question that I'd like to pose to you is, how do you view these historical developments of the Jackson administration, which are very multifaceted, but ultimately led to the ruin of the nation? And how do you view, as a unity, the takedown of the National Bank, the decision to cease the development of public lands, which was effectively responsible for our expansion into the West and the North, and the decision to break with the public lands and to offer those lands to what Jackson termed the best part of the population, namely the slave owners who, in the course of the Civil War, would become the great allies of Great Britain. So how do you view these historical developments?
Okay. Well, you had a process which was led by, actually, Nicholas Acusa, That's how the process started. And Cusa's influence acted directly on a fellow called Christopher Columbus. And Christopher Columbus, who was a maritime figure in the Atlantic, was in Portugal at one of his places where he met, and he met a gentleman who explained to him the work of Nicholas Cusa on the issue of use of navigation to move populations from Europe into other parts of the world in order to rescue civilization in the Eurasian area, to move it into new areas of settlement in which the people could emerge free of the evils of oligarchism, which were characteristic of the Eurasian continent. Yeah? And that's what the story was. Now, that we were crushed by what? We were crushed by empire. Now, we know the empires fairly well. People have now studied the history of the Trojan War and what that was. And we know that from that time, typified by the Trojan War, because of the detail with which we know it, fortunately due to some people who rediscovered the whole history, that Europe, civilization as we've known it in Eurasia and in Africa, has been dominated by various forms of imperialism. The imperial oligarchical system has dominated civilization. As a result of that, you have that people who are raised from one generation to the other, it's a social process. The human mind is a social process. Animals can be induced to improve their behavior by cultivation, but they don't have the voluntary initiative to create new states of nature, new states of themselves. Only the human species does. But because of the oligarchical system, which transforms people from what they are potentially as intellects into actually animals with a fixed pattern, they're raised as that, to go through the entire history of the oligarchical system. It's exactly that. Mankind is conditioned to a beast, exactly like the poor Slavs in the Roman Empire. That model. That model has persisted in Europe. We've had a few cases of great efforts to break from that system. Charlemagne, for example, in his best years, little references made to Charlemagne except on the feudal aspect of this thing. But Charlemagne is known for what? Inventing currency. That is a currency system, an economic system. He developed the river system, the internal maritime system of navigation of Europe. And he did it during the period of his reign. He set up an entire system. But at the time that he died, then the old system came back in again because the roots of evil were still there, and the roots took over. And he went into a real cycle of evil, of feudalism, evil. And to this day, the Roman Empire tradition persists. The British monarchy is not a monarchy. It's an empire. It's the empire that owns all of Africa. There's no part of Africa that is not controlled today by the British Empire. A mass murdering empire, with Susan Rice, for example, is one of the people with a black skin, a bit, but she's a mass murderer working for the British against the people of Africa and other states still today. A woman morally unfit to serve in any office on her record. A mass murderer of Africans. And that is specific. That is not a generalization. She did it, ran operations specifically in Kenya and elsewhere. And what she's doing now is the same thing that she did then. She's really a British agent. That's what she is. Totally a British imperial agent. And she has no place, no proper place of service in the United States government. She should be thrown out of the United States government in any capacity, now and forever. She's irredeemable. But that we now come to a point where the British Empire, and it is an empire, the Queen is an empress. She's an evil empress. What's her policy? Look at her policy. You're a human being. Now what's the human being's interest? What's happening to the human beings since Jack Kennedy was murdered? Downward. The condition of life in the United States has been on the main downward ever since Kennedy was assassinated. And the cover-up of the assassination was conducted as policy. You saw young children and, adolescents and so forth. Under Kennedy, Bill Clinton was one of them. Bill Clinton was a guy who went up from Arkansas, went up to the area, New York, Washington, to meet the president, John F. Kennedy. And he admired him, and very soon John F. Kennedy was slaughtered. And as a result of the slaughter of John F. Kennedy, which was done largely to two reasons. One, they wanted to destroy the United States. And they succeeded, step by step by step by step, and did it. What happened? We went into a war, a long war in Indochina, which was totally unnecessary, about 10 years of war for that particular case. And the warfare business never stopped since that point. Some wars stopped, but new ones started. The wars in Asia started all over again. We've had that ever since. So that the problem is that we have an unbroken history of imperialism, which we can understand in terms of the excavations and what was done in terms of the siege of Troy, where that image is because of excavation done on the site and the verification of the material that was known so clearly that became a model for consideration. And thus what we've had in European civilization, again, the imperial system. And the imperial system is universal. It's not just a British empire, it's an empire. It's an empire which spread over most of Europe. I mean, even, the Soviet Union, guess who controlled the Soviet Union? The British Empire. Now, there were conflicts in that process. To this day, the control of Russia is still located outside of Russia. It's located in the Caribbean. It's located in islands, little special islands in the Mediterranean Sea. And the people who live in Russia are under the pressure of people who live outside of Russia in the Caribbean and elsewhere, who are Russian-speaking, but they've gone over to be totally British agents. And even in Russia today, a good part of the population are essentially British agents. A whole faction of the scientists in the Soviet Union were British agents, trained by Bertrand Russell and people like him. So the problem is that our culture has been degenerated. Has not degenerated, it has been degenerated. And it's been degenerated by a long history of successions of oligarchical systems. And the oligarchical system is by its nature an imperialist system. And it's based on various degrees of the equivalent of slavery, or as a mental slavery, a brainwashing, which from generation to generation, the great majority of the people of the world are relatively rendered stupid because they are conditioned to submit to an oligarchical tradition. A tradition. And it's that evil tradition that makes slaves of people where even shackles would not hold them. And that's what the problem is here. And the problem is our people have been rendered stupid. Our people who, as I knew back, say, in the time of World War II, and I can compare the level of intelligence generally of various levels, typical levels of the population, I saw a degeneration, a sharp degeneration of the quality of the mental life of Americans coming out of World War II under Truman. The advent of Truman to replace Roosevelt was a downturn in the United States, a sharp and steep downturn and collapse, despite the fact we had a better president during the 1950s. It was a better situation, but the problem was still there. And then you had Eleanor Roosevelt, who took her husband's legacy and brought it into the presence of Jack Kennedy. And Kennedy and his brother were inspired to carry on the kind of mission that coincided with what Franklin Roosevelt had meant. The space program, for example. He was a key part of that. It was not simply some kind of gimmick. No, this was a clear understanding that mankind had to go into space. Man still has to go into space, because we're now faced with the solar system is changing, and is part of a galaxy which is also changing. And this thing is not going to go on the same old way forever. It never did and never will. No? The system changes. Old systems die out in the universe. New ones come into appearance. Changes occur in them. And we're now in a period where the sun is maybe 1 billion or 2 years away from explosion. And in scientific terms, you've got to think in those terms. But in the meantime, on the way to 1 billion or 2 billion years, somewhere along the line, perhaps much less than 1 billion years to come, the sun will not be suitable as a place for human beings to live in the solar system. And mankind will have to think about this, or should we say, develop, progress scientifically and otherwise, so that we are able to rise in terms of energy flux density of our mode of existence. And by so doing, we'll be able to do something about the future of mankind in light of a threatened decline in the worthiness of the solar system. And so for that reason, because of the stupefaction, the crippling of the ability of the human mind to function, and people who've been conditioned to submit, and a very increasing lack of actually intellectual leaders in society, that we are now at the point where only a small percentile of the qualified leadership of society is available to lead this nation and as other nations to a freedom from the threat of a destruction of the human species or something approaching that. And therefore, those of us who can do that must do that, must take the reins of leadership and get this idea of popular opinion out of the way. Popular opinion is the threatened destruction of the human species. If you want the human species to live, if you want your grandchildren to live, if you want things like that, you're going to want a change in the trend of things. And this time, we're going back. We're not going to make people stupid anymore. People today, university students and so forth, are less qualified intellectually than they were in my youth, my young adulthood, because they're educated differently. They're made more stupid. The drug problem. Look what happened in the period. The drug wars of the 1960s. There was no big drug war in the United States prior to Jack Kennedy's assassination. It wasn't really much of a drug war until the middle of the 1960s. Then you had a youth movement that began to degenerate. Morally, intellectually, in every way, degenerate. And they became more and more degenerate as they went along. That's your drug problem. The similar kinds of things. This is what the problem is. And the point is, they say, be popular. Go along with popular opinion. But popular opinion today is suicide for mankind. Destruction. What we need is the same spirit that Nicholas Acusa inspired in people like Christopher Columbus. When on a visit to Lisbon, where sea captain, professional Atlantic sea captain, Columbus, received the news from a priest, bishop, who was actually a close associate of Nicholas Acusa, and revealed to him what the plan was for crossing the Atlantic Ocean, how that could be done. And Nicholas Acusa, who had died during the meantime, still had his associates alive. And so Christopher Columbus spent a number of years actually researching this information he received from the friends of Nicholas Acusa, the surviving friends. That led to the concept of moving out of the corruption of the European culture in Africa, which had been degenerated by this kind of culture, and to lift mankind, or a section of mankind, up free from this kind of oligarchical tradition into a new land. And there were various experiments to do that. There were settlements in the Spanish-speaking area, from the Spanish-speaking area, which were actually useful. But what happened, there was a turnaround, as in Mexico. Those who spoke Spanish in Mexico were degenerated. Those in Colombia, the culture, the high culture, degenerated, and so forth. So therefore, the occupying oligarchical powers would always act to degenerate the population. And we in the United States had the same problem. We had a culture in the Massachusetts Bay Area which was highly successful. Then it was crushed by the British Empire, in fact, because it was not the British kingdom, it was the British Empire that did it. The Fourth Empire, the new empire. And that has been the case ever since. We've now come to the point that the tradition of empire is out to destroy everything. And the Queen is clear about it. Reduce the population of the human species from the order of 7 billion people to less than 1. Now, to look at the question of the history of evolution of animal species. Take that history. What is the history? The history is that the evolution of animals, just simply as animal life, is always progressively upward to higher energy flux densities. What is the Queen doing? The Queen is already doing, by destroying jobs, destroying meaningful work, exporting meaningful work to other countries, where they've been poorer for a long period of time, to destroy the United States, to destroy Mexico, to destroy these countries. And they are all being destroyed by drugs and so forth. And this practice, which is coming out of the British monarchy, is the leader of this whole operation. The terror that is occurring in the Near East is all coming from the same source, the British Empire, the Queen right now. And the question is, are there going to be somebody to take the place of Christopher Columbus, or people like Christopher Columbus? Are there people who can rise to an intellectual level, not being popular? If you want to be popular, you're not very useful. You have to be rather original and creative. You have to be a leader by inspiring people to rise to higher levels of intellectual effort, not poorer ones. To rise in the quality of mankind, not to degenerate to a lower level. And not to practice genocide, mass genocide, on the population of the United States, which is being done now and has been in progress ever since the war in Indochina, which we got into that. We never recovered from it. There was never a good time since that time. They meant good times in the minds of some people, but in terms of the welfare of society, things have been worse and worse and worse. ever since the advent of the second half of the 1960s. There has never been improvement. It's always been worse. And if you go along with popular opinion and popular trends, you are going to hell. And right now, that's on a fast track. And the question is, what are you going to do about it?
Wow. Well, on the drug question, I want to come back to that later. But for now, a question about what to do about that on the economic front. This is a question that comes from Shelley Asher, who does a lot of advocacy work for your policies on Capitol Hill. I'd like to pose her question and also throw in some more illuminating examples. So, Shelley wants to know, she says, I have a question which comes as a result of discussions with several members of Congress in the last few days regarding your three-point program, Glass-Steagall, the credit system, and NWAPA. This has come up a lot, both because of the so-called fiscal cliff and congressmen knowing that Obama is going for trillions of dollars in cuts, including brutal cuts for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, especially in the wake of Sandy and the discussion of the funds needed to rebuild, the role of the Army Corps. This is what we need to do. These specific discussions are also with members of Congress who have already co-sponsored Glass-Steagall and who understand that the whole discussion of the fiscal cliff, the deficit, the debt, is a fraudulent discussion. They are also major proponents of infrastructure. In fact, one member of Congress, insisting why we had to have major infrastructure development, described a hearing he had sponsored back in 2007 on the subject of major threats for which he felt the United States was unprepared, including an earthquake of magnitude 8 striking the New Madrid zone, a level 3 hurricane striking New Orleans, a level 3 hurricane hitting New York City. This congressman also discussed the danger of asteroids hitting the Earth, sending mankind the way of the dinosaurs, mentioning that there had been an extremely close flyby only a few months ago of an asteroid that wasn't even detected until a day before. This congressman then described in detail a 1-hour presentation that he and 3 other colleagues recently had on the House floor, where they proposed a $1 trillion plus infrastructure proposal to create 27 million jobs. One of the members involved cited Hamilton and his industrial manufacturing policy, another the St. Lawrence Seaway, another the 19th century New York Governor DeWitt Clinton, who built the Erie Canal. These congressmen all joined voices in calling for a 21st century New Deal. Now, I just wanted to, before I get to the question part of that, I wanted to read a few excerpts from this, because I think it's important for people to know that this discussion actually took place in Congress, of all places. For example, this is from Congressman Garamendi. He said, "How correct you are to look back to those heroes of the past that laid down our infrastructure. You can go back all the way to George Washington, who in his first year as President of the United States instructed Alexander Hamilton to develop an industrial policy. One part of that industrial policy was the development of infrastructure for America's commerce, and it was canals and ports and roads." Congresswoman Capter said, "I've had the great privilege of traveling out west. I think I've been in every state and almost every congressional district," she said, "and I came to look at the Hoover Dam. As I admired the dam, I thought to myself, America has it in her to land a man on the moon and to create NASA, but here at home, our public works, do we have the vision here? Do we have a vision big enough today in the 21st century to match what those who came before us gave that put this continent together?" Let me read one more of these. I think it was hard to choose because there's a lot of good things here. All right. One more on the St. Lawrence Seaway here. This is also from Congresswoman Capter. She said, "I look at the St. Lawrence Seaway and I think about Dwight Eisenhower, a great general who led our forces in Europe and came home and decided that America needed to create the St. Lawrence Seaway so that we could unlock the potential of the Great Lakes and the lower Great Lakes. And you say to yourself, today, with some of the limited thinking that some exhibit, of course, no one in this chamber would ever be accused of that, right? But could we do the St. Lawrence Seaway again today? Could we? I've had the great privilege of traveling out west." Oh, that was the Hoover Dam. Okay, I already got that. Okay, and then just one more about here it is. This is also from Congresswoman Capter. She said, "I just want to end with one image, which is really hard to capture in words, but one of our companies in Cleveland has the only 50,000-ton press in the United States of America, Alcoa. It's 7 stories tall. I feel very privileged as a representative to have been invited into the company to see this literally mammoth, magnificent machine be able to take parts and form them for industry as well as for defense. And it's 7 stories high. 3 layers on the 3 stories at the bottom are just dealing with the hydraulics. The engineering and the brain power it takes to manufacture high-end goods is incredible. We are so proud of the company and other companies that are able to make it in America." So this was definitely people should be encouraged to go through the whole 1-hour discussion. It took place in the evening, Tuesday evening, November 27th. So you can get the transcript and watch it on C-SPAN. So that illustrates this. Now here's Shelley's question to you. She says, "The question that came up with some of these members of Congress is, what does Glass-Steagall have to do with this economic recovery and infrastructure?" Now, these are all people who've co-sponsored Glass-Steagall. But the question they raise is that since interest rates are low, and the federal government can borrow money very cheaply, almost for free, and investing in infrastructure gives you a real rate of return, and debt's not a problem as long as you create wealth, then why do you first have to implement Glass-Steagall? What does Glass-Steagall have to do with federal government credit for infrastructure?
Well, first of all, you had a situation back in 1932-33 in which we had a really serious depression, and we also had a fascist attempt in the United States to take over the United States for a Hitler model in the United States. And Roosevelt and others, and a famous Marine leader of our Marine forces, intervened to expose the whole attempt to set up a fascist state inside the United States in the 1930s by overthrowing the Roosevelt administration. And so this kind of thing goes on all along. It's not a surprise that we have these kinds of problems. And the point is, what are the obstacles which are thrown in the faces of people which make them susceptible of capitulating to actually criminal stupidity, which is what's happened to the people. For example, the green policy, which is the major obstacle today, political obstacle today, in Europe and the United States, which is causing the greatest potential for genocide among people of the transatlantic region. And the intention of the British Queen is to reduce that population rapidly from 7 billion people to approximately 1. That's her intention. Now, if you look at the history of animals, animal species, no animal species has ever survived which operated on the basis of such a program. Anyone who's talking about population reduction as an economic policy is talking about the extermination of the human species. And anybody who follows that program and supports it is that kind of a criminal idiot and should be treated as such and sent to some institution where that appropriate treatment is given to cure them of this disease. But that's where the problem lies, essentially. Now, what's the positive side of the question? The problem is that the stupid belief in money. Money is only an accounting unit. It is not a measure of value. Now, what are we doing? We are developing hyperinflation in Europe and in the United States. We are starving people, crushing them, depriving them of employment, taking away their health care, and so forth. All for what? To feed the hyperinflation which is going on in the financial community. Well, this is damn nonsense. Now, what happens is now Glass-Steagall comes in, and people respond to Glass-Steagall because Roosevelt did it. It worked just fine. And when we canceled Glass-Steagall, we got into a lot of trouble. All our present problems are based on the cancellation of Glass-Steagall. Right? But what's the real problem here? It's not just the monetary problem. The problem is that people believe in money. They believe in money as being value. Now, money has no value. Now, it's true that gold and that other bullion has a use value, which can be put on a scale of relative usefulness and the cost of its production, relatively speaking. That's true. But that does not define the way an economy works. The way an economy works is what George Washington and others and his associates came up with. And that's the system that works. Money is not a measure of value. The idea of value comes into play, but how does it come into play? If you invest in money, what do you get? Just in money, you get hyperinflation. What do you invest in not to get hyperinflation? In production, in agriculture, in production, in improvement of the foundations of productivity in society by large dams, systems that protect our coasts from great floods, which were not installed when they were needed. And how stupid the mayor of New York can be? Only the governor of New Jersey can be more stupid than that, and bigger stupid. But anyway, so the point is, money is not a true measure of value. We call it a measure of value because some people like to value that sort of thing, but it doesn't do you any good. Money does not produce anything. What produces is people and resources, machine tools, and all that sort of thing, which enable people to become more productive. You know? Exactly what is the environmentalist says you must not do. The first thing you have to do, ask the environmentalist what he's going to do today for dinner, and don't do it. Then don't do it. Once you find out what it is, don't do it. Because they are stupid, but they're also animalistically stupid. And that's our big problem. It goes with the drugs. I have a right to drugs. You do? You're fed, aren't you? Yes. Well, drugs are not worth anything. You shouldn't be getting food for drugs. You shouldn't be doing these things. They're worthless. Produce something. Increase the productive powers of labor. Improve the standards of living, the physical standards of living. Improve health care, which helps people become more productive. Make inventions, make discoveries. Or let's go ahead and let's develop a system of defense against asteroids, which could extinguish our species. Remember, again, we have a limited number of years, somewhere probably less than 1 billion years left for to get on the ball and really get a system going that can take care of mankind without the sun, because our sun is not on a good course yet. It's not it's very shaky. But I think we can do things in our time. But that's the point. We have the responsibility of improving the ability of the human species as a species to exist. Now, mankind is the only species we know of which has a voluntary noetic capability. No other species does. And the only way in which a planet can be really successful, as Mars has not been too successful recently, is to develop mankind's ability on that planet, in that solar system, and you can turn planets into more profitable things for the benefit of humanity and other purposes in society. For security in the solar system, this sort of thing, or be outside the solar system if that need be the case. So therefore the idea of value is misplaced. It's assumed to be some intrinsic thing to money, and that is clinical insanity. And the United States, by its very successes, has demonstrated, as Massachusetts already demonstrated that back in the time of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, demonstrated it is the will of the human mind to improve the productive powers of labor and the means for protection of life, human life is particularly, and provide for the needs of mankind. Produce ideas, produce science, scientific progress, produce better products, better qualities of products, produce, and increase your ability to produce, to think better. Make your grandchildren proud of you for what you've done by making their lives better than you could yours, because you must give them the foundations on which they will do the better thing for the next generation. And that is the only moral purpose for economy, is that mankind has a unique capability to use of fire in all forms, to use more powerful forms of fire, to create a condition under which man can conquer problems which otherwise would not be solvable. Mankind is unique. It's the only creative being we know of on this universe. We know. We may be allowed to get the acquaintance of some others who are also in the know, shall we say, later on. But we have to earn that. Now that's the way. This is the problem. Money has no intrinsic value. Therefore, the system is threefold. It's not just Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall is necessary in order to bankrupt the enemy. That's what it does. It bankrupts the enemies of humanity. Because they are not allowed to conduct their little inflationary games and similar masturbatory efforts. Okay, so therefore what you need is a system which is going to increase the productive powers of labor. And this includes productive powers of labor as represented by scientific progress and similar kinds of things. It means actually defense of Earth against satellites coming in from within the range. We got millions of them ready to crack Earth or any place else nearby. So our existence on Earth depends upon our ability to meet the increasing problem if we have the threat to Earth from what's going on in the solar system. So therefore, our concern is to increase the productive powers of labor per capita and per square kilometer. And that becomes our standard. And you have to create the means. You have to make the discoveries, the scientific and related discoveries, like this example from Cleveland area. You have to create the machine, the kind of machine that can do the job that you need to get done. And that's what we should pay for, and nothing else. That determines value. So the system is increase the productive powers of labor per capita per square kilometer in those terms. So it's the productivity, the increasing power of productivity, scientifically driven productivity, higher energy flux density. Without higher energy flux density, this species of ours cannot survive. And that's what we have to do. And we have people, as you had the report on this little discussion, really typifies from some members of Congress, a discussion among them, typifies knowledgeable people, understand what the purpose of society, the missions of society ought to be. And we need to and people should be proud of the fact that there may be people out there who are more intelligent than they are, because they depend upon those people in order for them to progress, and also in order for them and their children to learn the lessons that will make them more intelligent people too.
Well, I'd like to change the subject from more intelligent people to less intelligent people. And a question came in from an institutional contact about the situation in Africa. But I'd like to sort of have a prelude to that question by discussing the role of Susan Rice, who, as many of you know, is up for the position of Secretary of State under Obama's new administration. So it was recently brought to light that In 1998, Susan Rice served as the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in the State Department, and she personally rebuffed an offer by the Sudanese government at that time to turn over Osama bin Laden, and who had moved it to Sudan in 1991. Her opposition to this offer was followed up very shortly afterwards by the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Kenya by Al-Qaeda, as we found out later, which really propelled bin Laden into the public eye. But this happened, and the U.S. ambassador to Kenya at that time requested additional security prior to that attack, which Rice failed to provide at that time as well. Now, Wednesday of this past week, Susan Collins had the displeasure of sitting down to a discussion with Susan Rice, and she raised this issue exactly, suggesting that Ms. Rice had to have been aware of the general threat and of the ambassador's repeated requests. Susan Rice, after that meeting, told reporters, "I asked Ambassador Rice what her role was. She said she would have to refresh her memory, but that she was not involved directly in turning down the requests. But surely, given her position as Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, she had to have been aware." So that is some more recent background. The question did come in, though, on the current situation in Africa, asking Mr. LaRouche, can you comment on the situation in Africa where the British Commonwealth faction appears to be promoting a string of genocidal conflicts, from the Rwandan-backed M23 invasion of eastern Congo, to the Mali situation, to Nigeria, which is on the edge of a total social explosion. This threatens to be the worst African genocide in 150 years.
Well, it would be because, first of all, this is Africa. Now, Africa is a special case, and it does get a very specially vicious kind of mass murder imposed upon the populations of Africa, and it often gets the Africans to do their own killing of themselves, because they stir up these kind of civil wars and competitions and so forth, and madnesses, absolute desperation and furiousness, like cannibalism practically. Yeah? And this is done. All of Africa is essentially a victim of the British Empire. And if you want to get anything better done for Africa, you've got to kick the British out of Africa, totally. Otherwise, you're not going to do anything for Africa. And I've been involved in African affairs on this level since the 1970s. And I know this business rather back and forward as far as I'm concerned. I've been involved in these countries, involved with their governments and so forth, in discussions with them and so forth. So I'm familiar with this whole area. And I can say fairly, not as bluff or anything else, I can say fairly, I know that the British Empire is the mass murderer of Africa, of black Africa. And that tells you what I think about Susan Rice as a racist, a British racist. Now this creature deserves no friendly consideration. She should be thrown out of office permanently, and take her boss, Obama, with her, because he is no good either. And that's the problem. We have so many people who are so damn stupid in the United States that they would vote for an Obama. Now, we don't have to have that Obama. We've reached the point where the question is, have we got the guts and the ability to make sure that Obama is not the next president. Why? Because of the hanging out impeachable offenses which he's gathered around him. Now, what they do is they come up with these discussions, what Obama and his admirers do. They come up with talking points. A talking point means talking around the subject, not talking to the subject, but talking around it, and trying to come up with some fairy story. Well, we can explain all this. We can explain it this way. Our friends that says, other friends of ours say we can do it this way. We don't have to do your way. We can work it out with talking points. Well, I should tell her to shut that damn talking point mouth and get some action here at the time that's appropriate. Now, this game of talking points, this fraud, it ought to be banned from all kinds of civilized conversation within 20 miles of the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Oh, man. All right, Len, I got a question on drugs for you here. I was recently, actually it was last night, the Foreign Policy Journal held a forum on transformations. Not quite sure what they meant by that, but there was a question posed to Secretary of State Clinton by the ambassador of Costa Rica on behalf of herself and also Honduras and the Dominican Republic. She asked about the war on drugs and asked Secretary Clinton, "Are you hopeful about eventually winning it?" Now, obviously, given the recent elections in the United States and the ballot measures on, on decriminalization of marijuana, there was a particular importance in this question being asked. Now, compare the complete absence of a push from the Obama administration now to let's look at 2 years ago. In 2010, Prop 19 in California would have decriminalized marijuana. Attorney General Holder opposed it. He said to the Californians that the federal government, he said, "We will vigorously enforce the Controlled Substances Act against those individuals and organizations that possess, manufacture, or distribute marijuana for recreational use, even if such activities are permitted under state law." Now, in this election, these initiatives passed, and there's been nothing coming from the Obama administration on what the response of the federal government will be to this, disparity between state law and federal law. I mean, obviously, if you really want to shut down, as you've said and as you've made the case, if you want to shut down the drug trade, you go after the biggest dealer, the biggest dope as well, which is the British Empire. Part of the trouble right now is a lack of an inspiration for the future, a lack of a basis in thinking to understand the problem posed by drugs. And I know you've discussed that one of the potentials of having a CCC-type program today for America's youth would be to get them out of situations that are rife with drug use as another way of developing a positive outlook. I'd like to ask you, what do you think Leibniz would say about these people's idea of what happiness is?
Well, I know what happiness is. I mean, I get deprived of it often enough. But no, happiness is actually accepting the fact that you're human. Now, in my experience of this, I've seen the worst happen after the death of John F. Kennedy. That did it. You take from the middle. We take the killing, Martin Luther King and some other killings that occurred during that period, which were obviously orchestrated things, done by people inside, shall we say, access to government circles. That's how it's done. And there are certain institutions, particularly our British institutions in particular, which do that. They commit these crimes. Now, you will take the history of drug trafficking, drug use inside the United States itself, and you can date that together with the freak shows that went on about the middle of the 1960s. You see, at first the Vietnam War was a major factor, an issue, but it didn't get really much bite until in the middle of this process of this war, which actually went on for about 10 years, really, if you take from beginning to end, this war, you find that there was a real active degeneration, which was drug-assisted, drug entertainment assisted decrepitation, and this produced the generation of the wild men of the 68ers. The 68ers was a product of this, and the 68ers are the key to the spread of this thing. For example, the 68ers back in '68, and I was involved in these concerns at that time, and Bobby Kennedy had been killed. He was on the eve of being appointed as the designated candidate for president. And these guys, the 68ers, the ones that went to Chicago slightly later, came from Massachusetts, came from New York at first. And these guys, with their sex and their gonorrhea festivals and so forth that they were conducting, and that's what really what was happening. These guys said they're going to celebrate and have a rally to celebrate the death of Bobby Kennedy. Huh? Well, I got on the horn and got to these guys and said, "You better cut this out, or you're going to be in real trouble." So they cut it out, but they didn't cut out that part of their memory or that part of their immorality. So what you have now is you have a degeneration of the American population under the influence of the counterculture, of the rock, drug, sex counterculture. And the drugs are merely the means, a medium of this process. But what's wrong is the mind. Their minds are diseased. Yeah, sure, the drugs cause a problem, but it's the minds that are diseased. The willpower, the choices, the behavior, the decisions, that's the disease. So you have a large section of the population, for example, in Mexico, an almost destroyed nation. I go back to the time that we had a president of Mexico who was a close friend of ours. He was quite a hero too, and he was turned down. But what's happened to Mexico since him? Ugly. What's happened to the United States and its people since the middle of the 1960s, the latter part of the 1960s? Same thing. Who does it? The Queen of England. She's the official dope peddler of the world. And she also is for mass death. How are you going to reduce the human population of this planet from 7 billion people to 1? How are you going to do that? Well, it's already being done for you by the economic policies which were installed from 2007 on, when the serious genocide started, economic genocide. And Obama is the most typical of the advocates of genocide, apart from the Queen herself, for whom he works.
Well, I think it's clear coming out of what we've done already with the first week of Congress being in session for the lame duck Congress, we have 2 more weeks remaining in this session. And as you made the point earlier this week, if Congress doesn't act and do something surprising, unexpected, and courageous, Obama will be in a position where he will have a free rein to do something that could prove very destructive for the nation and for the human race. So I think the words that we've heard you say tonight should be taken to heart, and we have a lot of work to do. Thank you for watching tonight. Thank you, Mr. LaRouche, and stay tuned to LaRouche Pack TV.